Dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin. But if anybody does sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. He is the atoning sacrifice for our sins, and not only for ours, but also for the sins of the whole world. We know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. The man who says, I know him, but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But if anyone obeys his word, God's love is truly made complete in them. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must walk as Jesus walked. 1182 was a terrible year to be born. Life in medieval Italy was violent, brutal, and short. Wars were constant. Brutal medieval wars, the kind where you hack your opponent with blunt instruments of war. It's a constant. So Pope is fighting the emperor, and the nobles are fighting each other. Christians are fighting Muslims in crusade after crusade. Famines, blight, pestilence, the Black Plague, like the four horsemen of the apocalypse always feel like they're just around the corner coming for you. Medical treatment still involved things like bleeding out bad humors and leeches. The Western world has become Christendom, in which everyone says, I'm Christian, but by that they mean more of like a cultural reference, like that's my cultural signifier, as opposed to anything having to do with their relationship with God through Jesus. And the church is a mess. The Eastern Church, based in modern-day Istanbul, the Eastern Orthodox Church, they're being slaughtered by Islamic jihadists at this time. And the Western Church, centered in Rome, is becoming a veritable font of like superstition and greed and immorality. In Rome, everything is for sale. Church leadership positions, women, the forgiveness of sins, everything. So 1182 was generally just a bad year. But that was the year that in Assisi, Italy, Pica Bernardone would give birth to a son, and she would christen him by the name Giovanni, John. So Pietro, the father, he was away on business. He was a dealer of luxury cloth. And he would travel from fair to fair, and think medieval fairs. So think knights and feudal lords and ladies all coming together and jousting and big drumsticks. Renaissance fair, you've probably been to one, right? That idea. His customers were the knights and the feudal lords and ladies, and he traveled across Europe attending these fairs, hawking his wares, and making a really good living selling designer luxury clothing to them. He was part of this rising merchant class. So at the time, for hundreds of years, it had just been a world controlled by birthright. So you had to be born into nobility. But in that world, he was a self-made man. So he's away on business in France, Pietro, and when he returns home, he takes one look at his son, and he said, he is not a Giovanni. And Pica's like, well, what do we call him then? It's like, we call him Frenchie. Seriously, in Italian, Francesco, that's what it means. And so from then on, he would be known as Francis of Assisi. The name stuck. For hundreds of years in Assisi, life had been pretty simple. Either by birth, you were born into the nobility, what they called the majors in English, the majors, or you were born into poverty and serfdom, the minors. You were a major or you were a minor. That's it. Those are the two choices, and it was all by birth. But the Bernardones, this whole rising middle class, it didn't quite fit into either this or that. So Pietro, he despised those who got everything handed to them on a platter just because they were born into it. He despised them, these nobles, and yet he imitated their lifestyle. And he was not of noble birth, but he actually despised the minors too, because he thought he was above them. He was neither this nor that. And that is how Francis grew up. So he ate and drank and dressed. His dad was a luxury clothing designer. Like a noble. That's what he looks like. That's what he imitated, but he despised them. And he was not of noble birth, yet he found the poor repulsive. So in the early years, his rich dad spoiled him. His mom indulged him, made him feel so special. So Francis took the route that many of our children take, unfortunately, of classic underachiever. Right? So he scraped by through school, achieved nothing of note academically, athletically, spiritually. In fact, by his late teens, the only achievement for which he was known was he was, and I quote, king of the parties. That was his title among his friends, which, do you know how you get the title king of the parties? Have you ever known someone like that, right? So St. Francis of Assisi was known for that. By his late teens, this man who would later be called the most perfect man since Jesus Christ, he was perfectly arrogant, perfectly self-indulgent. Then he turns 20, and it's 1202 AD, and war breaks out between the Pope and the Emperor, Pope Innocent III, and the Emperor at the time, get this guy's name, Frederick of Hohenstaufen. How great is that? So they're going to war, and Francis knew, as only a 20-year-old could confidently know, that he was destined for greatness. And so this was his moment. He was going to be an army of one. He was going to show up in the war and unleash his greatness, be knighted, and become the stuff of medieval legend. They would sing songs about him. He was convinced. So the spoiled rich kid who's never done anything in his life, comes out of his parents' basement, dusts the Doritos off his boxers, and puts on his armor and heads to war. He joins the army, charges into battle, thinking he's going to take over the world, and they get routed, embarrassed, devastated. And like that, the mirage of his greatness disappears. He would go on to see death at a scale that we can hardly imagine. Can you imagine a medieval battle? Have you seen the weapons they use? I have recently, in fact. I went into this museum, and you see these blunt instruments that are terribly inefficient and terribly close in proximity. So it's intimate. The person you kill, you look them in the eyes, you hear their scream, and it's not like one cut. You're smashing body parts over and over again. People are not dying. They're all groaning, bleeding on the ground. That's all of his friends. The only reason he wasn't cut down in battle was because the other army, they mistook him for nobility. They came upon him and was like, look how well this guy's dressed. He's wearing all luxury designer things. He must be a noble. So they took him and captured him for ransom. That's the only reason they didn't kill him. They throw him into prison just south of Perugia, which is an amazing place for chocolate. You should go there sometime. He's in prison, and while he's there for a year in this dungeon, wasting away, he gets deathly ill. Finally, his family raises enough money to pay the ransom. He comes home, but he is so sick that he's convinced he's going to die, and at times he wishes he would die. That's how sick he is, except that he's terrified because he realizes, I'm not ready to die. And that changes a person. So a year later, he's finally healthy enough, and so his dad's like, this boy finally took an interest in something, so I'm going to make him into a knight. So he takes his son, he's getting ready to send him off to yet another war, and Pietro sends a fortune outfitting Francis with the best horse, the best armor, the best sword available, and sends him off. They have this big parade in town. We're sending our son off to become a great warrior, a knight. And Francis makes it about 30 miles and then proceeds to give away his horse, his armor, his sword, and then walks back home with nothing. And his parents, they're like, what are you doing? They're ashamed. Why did you leave? Why did you give all this up? We just spent this fortune on you. And he has no good answer. He's just done with war. And so from this point on, Francis, he never really fits in at home. Like, he still shows up to the parties, but he's not really there. And he's still hanging out with his friends, but he has no desire to drink or tell jokes or chase women or put on these designer clothes. Like, nothing interests him anymore. And his friends are like, who is this guy? He was the king of the parties. Who is this guy? Now he has no interest in anything we're doing. Where are you, Francis? Where are you? And so they're like, I know what's wrong with him. He's in love. Who is it? Tell us, Francis, you're in love. Who's the lucky girl? And Francis, though, he isn't in love, at least not as they suppose. The woman he's flirting with is his later words, captured famously in this photo. He's flirting with Lady Poverty. He's thinking about giving up everything. Everything. Walking away from everything this world has to offer, because he's tried it and not found any of that helpful. So he's thinking about uniting his life with Lady Poverty. And yet he realizes that this would require giving up everything he's ever known, leaving his family, leaving the job, leaving any type of security he's ever known, and he's torn. So he goes into this period that you call a liminal period, meaning he's neither here nor there. He's crossing a threshold or a limit. So he's no longer the Francis that he was, but he's not yet the Francis who he will be. He's just caught in this in-between time, and so he spends his days like wandering around the countryside, hanging out in caves and ancient tombs, and doing a lot of moaning. In fact, there's a story from this time period that there was a guy walking into Assisi one day, and he heard like this terrible moaning, crying sound coming off from the side of the road. So he goes down and finds Francis sitting there. And he's like, what's going on? Are you okay? And Francis, he's so disturbed, so upset that he can hardly speak. And between his sobs, he gets out the phrase, Isaiah 53. And then he goes on to explain. He says, I have spent my whole life trying to look good, but Jesus had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. I've devoted my whole life to pleasure and popularity, but he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. He said, I hate the weak. I hate them. The minors, I hate them. I want nothing to do with them. And yet, like one from whom people hide their faces, Jesus was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Jesus was a minor. And then he said, lepers make me nauseous. And then he quoted Isaiah 53:4 from the Latin translation. It reads like this. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him like a leper, stricken by God and afflicted. And with that, Francis just loses it. See, in that day, leprosy was still common. And in fact, Francis knew this pretty graphically. He knew the smell. He knew this appearance of leprosy. There was a leper colony just outside of Assisi. At the time, they knew very little about the illness, so it kind of horrified everyone. Like, you weren't quite sure how to contract it. You just never wanted to be around those people. And if you don't know, it's a medical condition in which it has something to do with attacking the nervous system, where parts of the body literally, they just stop, they just die and then start to rot and fall off. And not to be grotesque about this, but it is important to actually appreciate what he's saying. I'm going to show you a picture. If you can't stomach it, please look away. Here's a picture of leprosy. So the flesh would literally rot, and this terrible smell and this appearance, like their nose would be missing or chunks of skin. And Francis, he knew this, and he was utterly repulsed by that. And yet he knew, Isaiah 53:4, that in the Latin translation, his Bible, the medieval Bible, it described Jesus as like a leper, that on the cross, his flesh was so severely beaten that it started to fall off, that Jesus on the cross was like a leper. And Francis read that, and he realized, I've spent my whole life trying to avoid Jesus. I find him repulsive. With my words, I say that I'm a Christian, but in my heart, I hate him. And when he says this, the stranger sitting next to Francis, he too starts to weep. And the two of them just sit by the side of the road in Assisi, weeping uncontrollably. So, unable to reconcile his life with what he claimed to be, like how he was living with what he said he believed, Francis spent the better part of his days for this period of this season of life just weeping. Until one day, he sees a leper on the roadside. And like always, he is repulsed. It is grotesque, like the smell, the look, everything about it. He wants to run away, but more than he wants to run away, he wants to know Jesus. He wants to become like Jesus. He wants to walk as Jesus walked. So he comes up to the man, pulls him in close in an embrace, shoves money into his hand, and then kisses him on the cheek. And at that moment, something happened. The leper was not miraculously healed, but it healed something in Francis. When he embraced the leper, he felt the embrace of Jesus. And like that, his mourning turned to dancing. So from that day forward, Francis would become known as the town crazy. Like his friends and family, they thought he'd gone completely mad. He spent his days laughing and having a good time with lepers. He became the king of partiers among lepers. He spent all of his time partying and laughing and joking with them and caring for them. And everyone thought, this is not only odd and gross, it's like he's completely lost his mind. He's insane. And then one day, Francis is praying, and he stops in this little church, St. Damian's. You can go there today. It's just down the hill from the main city. Like you go down through an olive grove. It's a beautiful little walk. And at the time, it was just a dilapidated small chapel. He goes in to pray, and he kneels before the crucifix. And to his surprise, in the middle of his prayers, he's alone in the church. He hears, "Francis, go and repair my church, which, as you see, is a ruin." And he's terrified. Did Jesus just speak to me? What was that voice? But then he looks around and sees there's no one there. It's just him and this little church. And he looks up at the crucifix and realizes, Jesus just said this to me. So he immediately gets up and unquestionably, he starts fixing the church he's in. He is now on a mission from God. He will sleep at that church. He will live at that church. He will do everything he can to fix up that little church. And this is worth pausing on because this gives us a little taste of the character of the man, something that will then grow into these big themes in his life. The first is this. Like a child, Francis takes everything absolutely literal. So when he reads Mark chapter 16, verse 15, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, he goes out and preaches to the birds. What? He just did that. And when Jesus says, my church is in ruin, it needs repair, he only thinks in terms of what is immediately in front of him. He's like, you're right, this place is a wreck. I got to fix it up. So he starts working on that church. It's only decades later when tens of thousands of people are following him, and he started this movement that's transforming the world. Only then can he become convinced when others are like, hey, do you think that maybe Jesus meant that you should repair the whole church and not just St. Damian's? It's like, oh, you think that? Yeah. So he took every word absolutely literal. The second thing that we see in this is that when Jesus speaks, Francis obeys. Unflinchingly, without hesitation, period. So whatever you and I might think about talking crucifixes, Francis was convinced that Jesus himself had given him this command, and that was that. Jesus said it. I have to do that. This is my mission from God. This is what I am to do. Period. So after this episode, he realizes that he's going to need a lot of money to build up this little church, and he doesn't own anything, but he knows where he can get money. So he makes a bad decision here. He goes home to his dad's warehouse, starts taking out the luxury cloth, and starts selling it, and taking all the funds to go rebuild the church. sells off a bunch of his dad's merchandise, and then Pietro comes home, finds out about this, and he is not super happy about this. My son, who I wanted to be a knight, and then goes off moaning in the countryside, is now just completely weird, hanging out with lepers, and now he's stealing from me, from the family business, from our family fortune. And so he locks him in the cellar, but mom can't take it, so she lets him out. And Francis goes right back to doing the same thing that he was doing. So finally, Pietro can't take anymore, and he decides he's going to take legal action. He grabs his son, drags him through the streets, and Assisi is a small town, so like the whole town could hear and see this. He drags him into the square. You can go there today. And he pulls him out, throws him in front of Guido, who is the local bishop, but not just the bishop, he's also the judicial authority in the town. And there, in front of the whole town's gathered to watch this, and Pietro says, I demand that you return everything he took from me and be expelled from the city. And then he looks at him and says, you are not my son. More hurtful words can hardly be thought up from a father to a son. Francis then famously says to him, not only will I pay you back what I took, I will return everything that is yours. And then he strips down, takes off all of his clothes, and hands them back to Pietro. Guido, the bishop, then covers him in a simple cloak, saying, you are now the son of a church. So we need to pause here. If all we see is a dispute between a father and a son, we've kind of missed it. This captivated the medieval Christian imagination because Francis, he wasn't just a rebellious son. He was trying to live out Matthew 10:37, which says, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He's not just giving up his family fortune. He is choosing, voluntarily, he is choosing. He wants to be married to Lady Poverty. Why? Luke 6:20, blessed are you who are poor. He wants to be blessed. He's not just getting naked. Like we usually think of naked and nudity as like funny or sexy. This was neither. So in the Middle Ages, there's this famous phrase that the church fathers would describe what it means to be a Christian. They say, nakedly I follow the naked Christ. That Jesus Christ on the cross was stripped entirely naked. That he entered into this horrific humility for our sake. And that wasn't sexy. That wasn't funny. That was love. That in love, he was willing to become completely humbled for our sake. And Francis, seeing his Lord like that, desperately wanted to know this love. He desperately wanted to be clothed in Christ, and he was willing to give up everything to know that love. So up to this point, he had denied Christ with his life, and this becomes the turning point. From this moment forward, he says, I will walk as Jesus walked. He would live what we in translation would call the gospel life, a life that is entirely formed by the gospel. The gospel is not just some set of facts you believe, but it's a way of life. It's the way of Jesus. It's not just believing that Jesus died for you and gave up his life and loves those who are unlovely. It's actually following Jesus in that way. The only problem is that when he makes that decision to follow this life, he doesn't know how to do it. So for the next 3 years, he tries his best to live like Jesus in every way that he can think up. Like he's homeless, he sleeps in the open or with animals or in a church. He doesn't own anything except the clothes on his back, the staff in his hand. He worked and begged for his food, but he was entirely alone in his endeavor, just wandering around the countryside like some homeless guy. So this becomes a time that actually will then mark what we know about Francis even to this day. From this time period of his life, we get two enduring lawn ornament decorations. It's true. Perhaps the greatest lawn ornament contributions of any of the church fathers come from Francis. The first is he is the reason that every December people all over the world get out their plastic baby Jesus, set him in the manger in the front lawn. Nativity, it was his idea, and you know why? He wanted everyone to see that Jesus came in poverty, that Jesus was a miner. He had nothing. You need to experience the humility of our Lord. The second one is the St. Francis figurine with optional bird bath. Yeah. So it was during these 3 years living with, and I quote, brother sun and sister moon, that Francis himself would become one of the world's leading lawn ornaments. He had this tremendous love for creation, for everything that God created, and spent a good amount of time talking to birds, trees, and wild animals, it seems. Yeah. So today, he's commonly portrayed as like some proto-hippie, but this is, it's kind of true, kind of not. He did not worship Mother Nature or Mother Earth. He did not. The reason Francis so loved creation is because in it, he could see Jesus. There's a historian, Franciscan monk, Nesta de Robeck, who has this fabulous little biography of Francis. And he describes, and remember, he's a Franciscan. He's chosen to follow Francis in this way. And he describes what he finds so attractive in Francis when it comes to his experience of creation. Listen to this. Everything spoke to Francis of his beloved. Christ the cornerstone, Christ the Lamb of God, Christ the light of the world, Christ the water of life, Christ the bread and wine of life, Christ the vine, Christ the way. All day long and in every place he had Christ before his eyes. He could hardly bear to put out a candle or see bread wasted or water polluted, all for the love of Jesus. He wanted a plot of land set aside for the cultivation of our brothers, the flowers, so that all would see them and remember the eternal sweetness of Christ. Christ, the creating word, was in every creature, shining in all beauty. Christ, the pilgrim, met him in every stranger. Christ, the crucified, in every sufferer. The risen Christ in all life. He was passionate about creation because he was passionate about Christ. For Francis, caring for creation was inextricably tied to loving Christ. Like, how could you love Christ and not love the creation that points to Christ? Is a good question. So after nearly 3 years of living in nature, waiting for God to show him the next step, Jesus would speak to him again, only this time it was through a church service. So he shows up to church one Sunday morning, and this is the reading. Matthew chapter 10. As you go, preach this message. The kingdom of heaven is near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Do not take any gold or silver or copper in your belts. Take no bag for the journey, no extra tunic or sandals or staff, for the worker is worth his keep. And he hears that. And he thinks, that's God's word to me. That's what God is saying to me. Jesus is telling me to do this. So he decides to literally do what Jesus said. And he immediately takes off his shoes, gives away his staff, anything extra he owns, and he's left with nothing but like a simple cloak. He ties a rope around his waist, and he goes. He's going to go out preaching. To this day, we actually have the cloak that he wore for the next 20 years. Same cloak. You can see it in Assisi on display. One cloak, 20 years. Now, we don't know that Francis was actually a good preacher. He was uneducated, untrained. But people were captivated by him because he literally did everything he preached. Soon, others wanted what Francis had. So Bernard, his first follower, was a guy who was actually a really wealthy merchant in town, owned a bunch of property. But he'd heard about Francis, saw the life of Francis, saw the joy that Francis had, saw this, that Francis was actually following Jesus in a way he'd never seen before. And he wanted to get in on that. So Bernard got to know Francis. And then eventually Francis says, well, if you want to follow me, that means you need to sell everything you have and give it away to the poor. And he said, let's do it. So they literally sold everything he had. They show up at church, the two of them, and they pull out their cloak, and it's full of silver, and they just start passing it out to anyone who will take it because they want to get rid of it. They want to get rid of it so that they can have a greater joy, the treasure of following Jesus. After that, Peter, a doctor of law, and then another, until there were 12 of them in all, living like homeless men, owning nothing, working, begging for what they couldn't make on their own, caring for lepers, and famous for laughing, telling jokes, and preaching. In 1210, they go to Rome to ask for the papal blessing from Pope Francis, or Innocent III, who was not so innocent. And Francis, he comes and says, I want to start a new monastic order. It's called the Friars Minor, which translates something like the low-class brothers or the redneck brothers. I don't know, something. It's a bad, whatever it is. And he says, what we want to do is we want to literally do everything Jesus said to do. Literally. If Jesus said it, we want to do it. That's what we want to do. And they kick him out as insane. Who's this homeless guy who just showed up? And then one of the cardinals finally comes to the Pope and says, and I quote, "How can we reject his way and say that it is too hard? It's nothing more than the way of life that Christ taught and lived himself. To reject Francis as insane is to reject Christ." So, in that way, the order of the Friars Minor, what we would call Franciscans, was born. And from that time forward, the Franciscan movement just catches fire. Thousands upon thousands from around Europe want to get in on what Francis has. They want to experience the joy and the hope and the life that is clearly breaking out in his life, that they're losing as they hold on to all their possessions, as they try and protect themselves, as they seek everything the world has, and yet it's destroying them. They want to get in on what he's got. They want that life because they see in him the life that is truly life. There's a telling story from this time period that one day he was on a walk with one of his companions, Massimo, and it goes like this. Here's the dialogue. Massimo says to him, "Why after you? Why after you?" And Francis says, "Well, what is this? What do you mean?" "I mean, why is it that all the world goes after you? Why do all men wish to see you, hear you, obey your word? For you're neither handsome, nor educated, nor of noble birth. How is it that all the world goes after you?" And Francis says, "Do you really want to know? It's because the Lord who is in heaven has found among men no one more wicked or imperfect or a greater sinner than I am. He chose me because I'm completely incapable of doing this on my own. He chose me to show the world that this is utterly a work of God." So in the next few decades, Franciscan preachers and missionaries would cover the known world. Francis himself would go to Egypt and cross over enemy lines so that he could share the love of Christ with Muslims who were killing Christians. Francis would then go on to die young, living under the open sky, eating only what people give you. It makes for a hard life. He was ill for most of his life. Some who knew him well claim that at the end of his life, he actually received the stigmata, which is the marks of the same scars that Jesus had. Historically, we don't know, but what we do know historically is that as he was about to die, he had one request: strip me entirely naked. He wanted to die like Jesus died. He wanted his last moment on earth to nakedly follow the naked Christ. So 1226, he's only 44 years old. He dies. And yet in his few years, he reshaped Western Christianity, reshaped our world. He made people believe once again it's actually possible to live the life of Jesus. That the gospel is not just something you believe, but it's a way of life. That it's actually possible to experience that love, hope, joy, all goodness, that peace of Christ now. Two thoughts, then we're done. The first thing that I want us to just reflect on as we think through Francis's life is this. He suggests that the gospel life isn't just for monks. The gospel life isn't just for monks. It isn't just for professionals. So he starts 3 orders of monastic orders. The first are the friars minor, the group of men that started with the 12 friends of his who owned nothing, took nothing with them, wore terribly uncomfortable robes, loved on lepers, and laughed a lot. Those guys. And then he started a group called the Poor Clares, which is basically a female version, nuns, of the exact same thing. But then in 1221, he starts what we know as the Third Order of Franciscans. And see, as they were preaching all over the world about this gospel life, about the life of Jesus, about the person of Jesus, and people saw in them this great joy with which they gave things up, sincere Christians all over the world said, hey, what about me? I'm not called to be a monk or a nun. Like, I'm already married, or I have this obligation, or I'm called to serve the government like this, or I'm called to this job, or I'm called to do this thing. God has called me there. How do I follow Jesus like this? Because Jesus invites all of us to come follow me. Pick up your cross and follow me. Walk as he walked. So let's clarify here. The good news, the gospel, isn't that we can live a perfect life if we try hard enough. That's not it. The gospel is that Jesus is king. It's not that you can earn your way into that life. It's that he's already earned it for you. He's already accomplished all of it. The gospel life, then, is not about what you do. It's about what you receive. That if we trust him, if we believe him, if we trust that what he says is really the way, the truth, and the life, if we follow him, he invites us to receive his life of sacrifice and love and surrender and joy. That we can all participate in that, not because we earned it, but because he shares it with us. He gives it to us. He earned it for us on our behalf. So the gospel life isn't something you achieve. It's something you can receive. But not everyone wants to receive it. So what's it look like to live the gospel life when you're not a monk? Well, that's a good question, and frankly, I think that's something we still need to figure out today in our time and our place. But Francis gives us a few guiding principles. Let me just point out 4. The first is this: love unlovely people. Because Christ loved me when I was unlovely, Romans 5:8. To walk as Jesus walked means I love unlovely people. Now, you don't have to go out and find lepers. There are lots of unlovely people in our world today. You don't have to look far. If you need help, I can point you in the right direction, or just get on social media. All right? You're called to love them. So when you find someone who's unlovely, if you want to be like Jesus, love that person. Matthew 25:40, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. The second is see Jesus in creation. Like, you don't have to talk to birds to see God in creation. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the works of his hands. That in creation you can meet the God of the universe. Creation is not God, but it points to him. It's his handiwork. It's how we experience his grace and his goodness. Number 3, don't find your value in money or possessions. So you don't have to go naked and homeless in order to love God with all you have. Paul says, Philippians chapter 4, verse 11, that the gospel teaches us to be, and I quote, content in all circumstances. That your joy, your value is not dependent on what you have, because we have everything in Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he says it this way: what I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not. Those who mourn as if they did not. Those who are happy as if they were not. Those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep. For the world in its present form is passing away. And number 4, enjoy life with God. Delight in God. So, in Philippians, while Paul is sitting in prison on death row thinking he's going to be executed, he commands, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Now, Francis took that as a literal command, and he took that seriously. I should delight, I should rejoice, I should find joy in the Lord and what he gives me and who he is and what he's done for me. And so the Franciscans are known to this day. If you meet them, you will experience this as God's joculars, which means jesters or tricksters or funny guys or something. They're always laughing or like singing a song or having a good time. To this day, Francis's like joy-filled life stands as a convicting and inspiring reminder that the life of Jesus is not impossible to follow, and it is not a calling to a life of misery. It is a calling to peace and all goodness. So the first is that the gospel life isn't just for monks. The second big thing is that we need to learn from Francis. Why Francis is not like us is that when Jesus speaks, he obeys. So I've read a lot of stories about Francis at this point. His Little Flowers, which are his sayings, collection of sayings and from his friends. And then a number of biographies, and then had a chance to go to Assisi a number of times and visited the sites of St. Damian's, and then we've even hiked like the way. I've walked the way of St. Francis. It's a path that goes through Italy. I've been in the caves where he prayed and he cried out to God. We've been to the site where supposedly he received the stigmata. Like I've seen and I've experienced, and I've met a number of Franciscans along the way. I've got to know his life, and the thing that always stands out to me as I reflect on this man's life is that this little man, in 20 years, he changed the course of history. He reshaped, in some ways saved medieval Christians. To this day, there are millions, if not billions, who are influenced by this man. And the thing that just is so shocking to me is I'm smarter than this man. It always stands out to me. It really does. And I'm not just being cocky here. I mean, I know way more like Bible and theology. I'm much better at interpreting the scriptures than this guy. I'm clearly a better preacher than him. If some homeless-looking guy showed up in here and walked up on our stage and tried to preach here, if Francis showed up, I don't know that we would let him preach a news story. So here's the question. How is it that this little ignorant man changed the world? How is it that this little uneducated man went on to influence, to this day, millions to love Jesus better? I'll tell you, when Jesus speaks, he obeyed. At my old church in Dallas, there was a woman, Brenda. She had a rough life. She was older. When I finally knew her, she was a widow. She had cancer, disabilities, end of her life. It was hard. She couldn't pay any of her own bills. She was out of work. She couldn't work, disabled. And so rightly, the church stepped in to support her, help her cover her bills, and I was part of that process. But here's the thing. We found that no matter how much money we gave her, for some reason she was unable to pay her bills. And so me and a couple others, we started probing, and we met with her, and we come to find out what's happening. That we would give her money during the week, and then on Sunday, she would come back and put it all in the offering box. We're like, what's going on here? We're trying to help you. Why? Why are you doing that? Get this. She had read Mark chapter 12, this story about the widow who had nothing except 2 little coins. And she gave everything she had, and she was praised by Jesus. And Brenda was a dying widow, and all she wanted was to be praised by Jesus. Now you and I, we are way smarter than Brenda, way smarter than Francis. We know how to interpret the scriptures. We know that there's right applications, wrong applications. We know how to discern all this. But it makes me wonder if Brenda and Francis might actually be onto something. They might know something we don't know. Oh, to be simple, to follow Jesus like that. Father, I pray, Lord, that you will help us, as you've not called many of us to be monks and nuns, but you have called all of us to follow Jesus. I pray, Lord, that you would show us what that looks like in our lives, in our day, in our time, with our responsibilities. How do we be faithful to let go of all the things that so entrap our hearts and pull us away from you and find our joy and our contentment in you, so that we can say with Francis that you are the way, you are the truth, you are the life that is truly life. Father, we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.